You do what you need to do. I'm going to start class whether they're sitting down or not. So, oh. It is a wonderful sight, I'll just tell you, to see all of y'all hugging and talking to each other and all that. It's just great. It is a pleasure to see everybody this morning. We are going to get right into our lessons this morning. Matt, would you lead us in a word of prayer before we get started?
Our Father in heaven, Lord, we're grateful for this first day of the week, another beautiful day that it is. Many blessings of life that you provide for us, the beauty of your creation that we get to enjoy. For this opportunity that we've been blessed with, Lord, to be able to assemble here this morning and study your word. We ask that as we enter into this study that you would guide us, help us to have clear understanding of those things that we're about to study. Help us to make proper application of your word in our lives so that as we go back out into the world, we can carry your word with us and be able to accurately answer questions and take advantage of opportunities when they arise to spread your word, Lord. Thank you so much for the love that you have for us, for your Son that gave his life for our sins. So as we pray in Christ's holy name.
Amen. We are working through the book of Matthew, for those who are visiting with us this morning, Jesus the Messiah. We are in chapter 13, but we actually have to finish up chapter 12. So if you've got last week's lesson, open that up and we'll finish those last two questions there. We're looking at the examination of the Messiah in chapter 11. There was an appeal for examination, and we see there Matthew, showing the reader, look, see that this is the Messiah. In chapter 12, what we find is his refusal of examination. The Pharisees don't even think about Jesus being the Messiah. And that's what we're seeing here in chapter 12. You remember there beginning in verse 22 that we saw that, here Jesus is casting out demons, and what do they say about him? Yeah, casting them out by Beelzebub. You're casting out the devil's demons by the devil himself. Is what they're talking about. And of course, Jesus refutes that in the things that he talks about there, and we looked at that last week. Look at verses 38 through 45. It says, Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. And I'm not going to read the rest of that for time's sake. But number 5 there on your question sheet, why did the Pharisees want a sign? So they would know it was him. Any other answers? Okay, we don't see evidence of that, but maybe they're trying to trip him up. You're not going to show us a sign. Y'all, show us a sign. That sort of thing. Yeah. Might want to use it against him. Yeah. Could be. Those are all great answers. I don't have a good answer. No, I don't have a good answer. All of those could be possibly it. I guess what it boils down to, though, is the fact that they don't believe he's Jesus. He's the Messiah. They do not believe in any way, and they're not going to believe that He is the Messiah. They've already made up in their minds that they are not going to believe. And so whenever they're asking for a sign here, it is not a legitimate ask. How do I know that's not a legitimate ask? Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, but and that's what Matt said, he didn't give them one, but what has Jesus been doing? Miracles. I mean, He's been doing signs. They have seen the signs. They have seen the signs. And so this is not a legitimate question because, the signs are right there in front of them. And now let's go to the second part of that question. Why did He not show them a sign? Okay, He didn't need to, maybe. What does the text say? All right, He's already done them, but you notice He doesn't say that. Look at verse 39. What is His response? Yeah, they are an evil and adulterous generation. That's why Jesus did not show them a sign. Now, He's not talking to all the people. He's talking to the Pharisees here. And He is calling them an evil and adulterous generation. They were morally corrupt, evil. What does He mean by adulterous? Does that mean that they're sleeping around? No. Yeah, what that basically means is they're unfaithful to God. That's what that means. He'd already gave them a sign, many signs earlier, but what was the sign He mentioned here? All right, Jonah and the well, and what is He referring to? 3 days in, 3 days out. What? He's talking about the resurrection, yeah. That's what He's talking about. And so, so that's not a sign for them right at the moment. Is it going to be a sign later? Yeah, it absolutely is. Will they receive that sign then? Nope. No, because they're an evil and adulterous generation. He talked about Nineveh. Why is it that Nineveh will rise up in judgment against this generation and condemn it? Have you considered why Matthew is writing those things? Why did Jesus say those things? Yeah, they repented at what? What did Nineveh repent at? The teaching and preaching of Jonah. Jonah said, in so many days, the Lord is going to destroy you. You need to repent. And what did they do? It was as simple as that. And here Jesus is not only preaching, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but He's showing the power of God through the things He's doing. And what are they doing? They're rejected. They're not paying any attention to Him. They don't want anything to do with Him. What about the Queen of Sheba? Why did He bring up the Queen of Sheba? Came from a far land, but why did she come from a far land? To hear Solomon's wisdom. Why? I mean, think about that. Why would she come from a far land to hear the wisdom of Solomon? All right, maybe she heard about his faith in the Lord. I tend to think probably that's not it. I mean, you think about why is it that Jesus said that? Why is it Matthew's recording that? She heard rumors about Solomon's wisdom and believed it. And here the Pharisees have the Messiah right in front of them, and they won't even believe. You see what Jesus is doing, what Matthew's doing? He is showing again the ridiculousness of the Pharisees not paying attention to the fact this is the Messiah. And that's what Matthew is trying to bring out for his Jewish readers, just to show that contrast in those who will not believe. And you notice I say will not believe. Down there in verses 43 through 45, you have that unclean spirit, that goes out of man, goes out, looks for a place, doesn't find it, comes back, all of that. This is in reference to the Pharisees. The Pharisees rejected Christ. He is right there in front of them, and so the latter state is worse than before. That's what that's talking about. It is showing that the Pharisees are worse off, having known the evidence and rejected it. They are worse off now than before. Any thoughts or questions, comments? Yes. Yeah, they were more concerned with Rome. They were more concerned with men. How does this affect me in this life? That's really what they were after. Yeah. Anything else? All right, let's finish up this chapter. Here in verses 46 through 50, we have this episode where Jesus' mother and brothers are coming and they're wanting to speak to Jesus. And you remember Jesus said, look, and he said of his disciples, those around him, said, this is my mother and my brother and my sister, or however he said that. Look at verse number 6 on your question sheet. What does context imply about the beliefs of Jesus' family? His family is the people who follow him, yes, but I'm talking about his biological family. What is this saying about their beliefs about Jesus? They don't believe. At this point, Jesus' family do not believe, or at least they don't understand. We have, in other accounts, we have evidence, that his brothers say, you know what, go on up to Jerusalem. They're kind of being snide at him, said, if you are really all of that, go up and show the people who you are. They don't believe at this point. And so this is fitting in with this refusal of examination, you see. It is. I saw one commentator put down the idea that maybe they're coming to Jesus to try and get him to stop what he's doing. Look, you're causing a stir. The Pharisees are getting upset. This is going to be a big problem for the family, and you need to kind of calm down a little bit. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's interesting to think of it that way. We need to remember that we need to read this from the standpoint of Matthew's purpose in writing these things. Here he is in chapter 12, and I know that man put the chapter divisions in there, but he's talking about the rejection of the Pharisees, all throughout chapter 12, the rejection of the Pharisees. And then all of a sudden, it's the rejection of his family, in a sense. And so it's just interesting to see those things. They are refusing to hear him and understand who he is at this point. Okay, so we get into chapter 13, and that's where our lesson sheet is from today. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Last question. I was about to skip right over that. Who does Jesus consider to be his family? Yeah, his disciples, his followers, those who believe in him. Those are the ones he said, he's not going to base that upon physical family relations. It is going to be those who believe in him. Okay. Any thoughts or questions or comments before we continue? Chapter 13 is the teaching section of this examination of the Messiah. As we have said, those who are visiting may not know this, but if you look through the book of Matthew, look at toward the end of chapter 13, verse 53. Says, now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables. All right? You're going to find several sections in the book of Matthew, and they end with a phrase similar to that. When he finished his teaching, when he finished these sayings, that's showing kind of the end of that section. And so it's a narrative. That's what we saw in chapters 11 and 12, followed by a teaching section, and that's what we have in chapter 13. And so let's look through this teaching section. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these parables because we've heard lessons on these parables, over and over. And I'll probably go back and I'll do some lessons based on these parables. But what our purpose is this morning is to look and see, okay, why is Matthew writing what he's writing, and what is he trying to communicate to his readers? All right? Look with me in verse 1. It says, on the same day. Okay, what day is that? Do you remember? The Sabbath day. Chapter 12, that's all done on the Sabbath day. And so on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables. And then you have the parable of the sower. Okay? This kind of goes all the way through verse 23, because we have him telling the parable of the sower. There is kind of an intermediate part. Look at verse 10. And the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? And Jesus explains why he's speaking to them in parables. And then you get to verse 18, and he begins to explain the parable of the sower. Okay? Let's go and let's look at Jesus' explanation in verses 11 through 17. He answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are the eyes, for they see, your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. Now, let me say this. I'm not going to read the explanation of the parable, but understand the explanation of the parable is part of Jesus' explanation to the answering their question. Why are you speaking in parables? The parable itself has to do with why are you speaking in parables. I want you to see that. All right, let's look at number 1. To whom is Jesus telling this parable? The multitudes. Okay, and so there is this crowd that has gathered around him, and it is such a crowd, and he's by the seashore, and so he gets in a boat so that he can be separated from them in a little bit to be able to speak to everyone. All right, so this is a general message that he is giving to the multitudes. Again, this is the same day. It's the Sabbath day. Note verse 3. It says, he spoke many things to them in parables. Okay? He spoke many things. So we don't have all of the things written that Jesus spoke. We need to understand that. He spoke a lot of things in parables. But this one, Matthew has written down for a specific purpose. And we miss it. And people who preach it, and I'll preach it the way everybody preaches it sometimes, but we miss it when we do that. We miss the reason why Matthew has recorded this parable here. All Jesus taught is not written here, but here we have this one. All right, the second question there, what do his disciples ask? Why do you speak to them in parables? Why are you doing this? Why are you telling these stories instead of just outright teaching them, about the kingdom and things? Why are you telling them these stories? Now, notice how they ask it. Why do you speak to them? Okay? How does Jesus speak to his disciples? It's more directly, yeah, to his disciples, and we actually see that here. But he's not doing that with the multitude. He is telling these parables. You know, the Sermon on the Mount. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. How many parables were in the Sermon on the Mount? Chapters 5, 6, and 7. None. There were no parables in the Sermon on the Mount. That was a different group of people. He is in a different place now. Jesus knows who he's talking to, and he knows how they will receive. The people who were listening then, what was the result of the Sermon on the Mount? What did they say? You know, they were astonished, shocked, because he spoke as one having authority. You see, the people he was talking to then recognized that authority. Evidently, the people he's talking to now, he knows, would not recognize that authority. That's a very good question, and I don't think we have the answer to that. She's asking, is this just Jews, or is it a mixture of Jews and Gentiles? Probably just Jews. If there are Gentiles, they're kind of in the back, you know, away from everybody, and maybe just kind of over here and that sort of thing. But there might be. All right? Now, remember what I said. There's a reason why Matthew is recording these things. All right? The last part of that question, how does Jesus respond? All right, so he's yes, because right there in verse 11, because it's been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. His disciples are hearing his teaching. The multitudes will not hear. Do you see the difference? Do you see what's going on here? The parable of the sower, what does the parable of the sower teach? What does the parable of the sower teach? All right, response to the Word. You know, how people receive the Word. You've got some people, they hear what's being said, and what happens? It's gone. It's gone. All right, and then you've got some people that receive it, but it's, you know, it's stony ground, there's no root there, and so it doesn't take long that it's just, you know, they fall away from it. And then you've got some, you know, and those different types of hearers is what he's talking about there. Matthew is showing us an introduction to the teaching of Jesus' parables. Do you see that? That's what this is. It is an introduction to the teaching of his parables. Look at verse 12. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. What has that got to do with anything? What does that mean? Okay, it's about how you use your abundance. What kind of abundance are we talking about? Okay, how you use yourself, giving to others. Is he talking about giving to others in this explanation? What has this got to do with? It has to do with knowledge. But that's, see, we go to these verses like that, though, and we go there. You know, whatever you've got, use it abundantly. Well, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the knowledge. He's talking about, you know, those who will hear. All right, so he's talking about his disciples, keep on believing. Okay, all right. However, that doesn't fit in the context because he told the parable to the multitudes. That's who he's trying to teach. I struggled with this verse for a long time trying to figure out. I've been talking about years trying to figure out. The older I get, the more I understand this verse. Here's what I mean. And I just thought of this. Sorry, Nathan. I just thought of this illustration this morning on the way. Something Nathan said. I asked Nathan what key a certain song was written in that the boys played. Well, he's the drummer. So you don't ask a drummer what key a song is written or played in. Okay, now he knows about music and keys and all this stuff, but it's that kind of. Why don't you do that? Think about it in terms of language. Those who have studied language, okay, and I thought about putting up, a foreign language up here and showing. When you see something written in a foreign language, and I don't mean using the same letters like we use, but some languages, what does it look like to you? Chicken scratch. It's just scribbles on a paper, right? Because you don't know anything about that language. Let me tell you something. Greek is kind of that way. Greek is it's a little bit closer to using our types of letters, but still it's that way. And if you look at something written in Greek, if you don't have any idea anything about the Greek language, it just looks like chicken scratch. It looks like gibberish. What happens when you study and learn maybe the alphabet of that language? Maybe not understand it, but you see it and you realize, oh, that's Greek. I understand. I can go maybe get a lexicon now and I can look up something and find what matches that, and have a little insight. As I went through school, it was amazing to me the things that were brought to light that just helped me understand how to study. Because I'll just tell you, there are things, when I went to electronics school, I knew a little bit about electronics because Dad did that in the Air Force, so I had a little bit of background knowledge in electronics. I did a whole lot better in school because of that. Whereas some of my fellow students didn't do so well because they didn't have any of that background. That's what this verse is talking about. It is different levels of perception to the teaching. The disciples had a little bit of that knowledge. They'd been hearing some of that teaching, and so their minds were a little bit geared toward what Jesus was doing. And here we come across this parable that he tells. And now all of a sudden they're asking, why are you teaching in parables? You used to teach to us plainly. Why are you now teaching in parables? And so Jesus is explaining, they're not ready to hear it yet. They're not ready to hear these things. And so that's what he's doing. Any thoughts on that? I had a lot more written down here to talk about on that, but I know we'll never make it if I keep on going. All right, you notice the prophecy that he quotes there. Hearing you will hear and shall not understand. That's exactly what's happening with the multitudes. He's telling these parables. We go back and we look at these parables and we see the lessons being taught by these parables. But they didn't see that. All they're hearing in their mind is, there's a story about a guy planting seed. Birds coming down and eating the seed. That's what they focus on, the incidentals. They're not ready to hear the underlying message. All right, let's continue on. Let's look at verses 24 through 35. Now, we've got the parables of the wheat and tares in verses 24 through 30. the parable of the mustard seed, verses 31 and 32, the parable of 11, verse 33. We don't get the explanation of the parable of the tares until over in verse 37 beginning, but we'll not deal with that right at the moment. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. What I want you to notice is, after that initial parable here in chapter 13, you have parables told in threes. You've got 3 parables here. You've got, beginning in verse 44, you have 3 parables. All right, and so they're told in threes. That's significant, I believe. Looking at these 3 parables here in verses 24 through 33, what do you notice different about these 3 parables? And I mean different from the parable of the sower. All right, each one starts with the kingdom of heaven is like. You didn't have that in the parable of the sower. We always apply the parable of the sower to the kingdom because he explains, it's the word, and absolutely that does apply in those ways, but that was not his purpose in telling the parable. You see, here, these 3 parables, what are they teaching about? What is the common theme in this teaching besides the kingdom of heaven is like? Okay, we've got sowing the seed, but in 33, that's not seed, that parable. Exponential growth, all right, and so maybe talking about the growth of, that's where I landed, was the spread of the kingdom, the growth of the kingdom is what is being discussed here. The parable of the tares is about a man sowing seed. What does seed do? It grows and then what? It produces a crop. Okay? That's the focus of that parable. It grows and produces a crop. The kingdom of heaven is like planting seed in order to yield a crop. Okay? And we see the contrast. Here's the bad seed sown in there and all of that. And we'll talk about that explanation here in a little bit. What about the parable of the mustard seed? What does that show about the spread of the kingdom? The first one shows that spreading the seed yields a crop. What does the second one show? That little seed will grow into a big plant, like the kingdom. It'll start really small, but it'll grow into a large kingdom. Okay? Now, the third parable is talking about putting leaven in basically bread dough, is what it's talking about. All right, so what's this one teaching? It can go a long way, and that's the key right there. It will the spread will be throughout the whole thing. So the first parable is talking about the fact that the crop will yield, it is planted to yield a crop. The second one shows that it will be small, but it'll grow really large. And the third one is showing that once it gets started, it's going to spread everywhere. Okay? And so he is showing how the kingdom is going to spread. All right? Why does Matthew record that he only spoke in parables? Look with me in verses 34 and 35. He says, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Why did Jesus only speak in parables? To fulfill prophecy. See, y'all are catching on. You are catching on. Again, we have a prophecy here that Matthew is bringing to light that the Jews would not necessarily see right off the bat that is a prophecy about the Messiah. And again, you need to go, that's from Psalm 78. Now let me tell you something about that psalm. That psalm begins with this, That's not the first verse, it's verse 2, I believe it is. But it goes through the whole history of the children of Israel. That one psalm does. Okay? So this prophecy it is fulfilling, Jesus is fulfilling that prophecy, but that psalm begins with the fact that I will tell you a parable. And yet throughout that psalm, there are no parables. There's no parables in that psalm. It is just rehearsing the history of the children of Israel. And so you can see why, as maybe they're singing that psalm or they're reciting that psalm, they may see that and they may just read right through it because here he is telling the story of Israel. But they didn't realize, oh, wait a minute, this is talking about the Messiah and what he is going to do. If you go to Psalm 78, I want to read to you verse 1. It says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law, incline your ears to the words of my mouth." Do you see how that psalm is bringing the idea that you people need to be listening? Whenever he recites that prophecy, when Matthew writes that down here, the Jews who are reading this know immediately what psalm he's reading from, and they have in mind the rest of that psalm because the Jews recited these things. They knew these things. So it fits in with Matthew's purpose. It's helping them to understand. Oh, I didn't even put our so sorry. Understanding the examination. That's what he's doing here in chapter 13. He's helping the reader understand this examination of the Messiah. Look at his teaching. Pay attention to what he's saying so that you will know. Something else that we find in here, and we'll see this as we go on a little bit further, is Matthew is helping the reader understand, but Jesus is helping his disciples understand. And so we see that him helping them through those things. All right? Any questions or comments before we go on? Okay, in verses 36 through 53, this is really all we're going to discuss this morning. And I know that's not the end of the chapter, but there's a reason for that. And that's because of what I said earlier about 53 being the end of that section. Man put those chapter divisions in there. God didn't put those chapter divisions. And so we're actually going to end there in verse 53. But notice in verse 36, then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field." Now, question. Did they ask in the beginning of the chapter for Jesus to explain the parable of the sower? No. No, they didn't. Jesus explained it. Maybe they were embarrassed to say that they didn't really understand what it meant, or something like that. Maybe it is they had some understanding, but Jesus wanted to better explain it to them. But here we have an indication that, okay, now that parable, they didn't ask about the parable of the mustard seed or the parable of the leaven. In their minds, they're understanding that. They've heard enough of Jesus' teaching that they're getting that. But the parable of the tares, what's different about that? You've got good and evil. And you not only have good and evil, but you have a result that will happen to the good and evil. Okay? There's some deeper things in that parable. And so his disciples, notice what I want you to notice with me in verse 36. We have a different setting. He was preaching to the multitudes and teaching the multitudes. That is no longer the case. He has left the multitudes now. He has gone into the house and now speaking only to his disciples. All right? What do they, okay, I've already answered those questions. What did they ask of him? They asked to explain the parable of the tares. All right, how does Jesus respond? How does he explain? all right, with some parables. He explains the parable in verses 37 through 43, but then immediately tells 3 more parables. You see that? Isn't that interesting? You know, Jesus was like that. Whenever somebody asked him a question, how did he answer it a lot of times? With a question. Yeah, he would come back with a question and ask them, helping them to understand these things. So he's explaining the parables, and then he tells 3 more. Jesus is helping them, his disciples, to understand what the kingdom of heaven will be like. The parable itself spends more time, and I'm not going to take time to do that. You go back and read the parable of the tares, and then read the explanation. The parable itself spends more time on what to do with the tares that were sown in the field. Whereas in Jesus' explanation, it spends more time on the result, the second coming. Okay? And so it's a little bit different focus from the parable itself and then, in contrast with his explanation. But what that shows us is, and if you study these explanations and how Jesus explains his parables, it will help you to better understand the parables that he teaches, that he doesn't explain. Because it helps you to see, okay, yes, he's talking about all of these things, but what is Jesus focusing on? What is the main lesson he's trying to teach? And so he helps with that. Now, if looking at the next 3 parables, what do they teach? So in verse 44, we've got the parable of the hidden treasure. 45, we've got the parable of the pearl of great price. And then 47 and following have the parable of the dragnet. It's still the kingdom of heaven. We're still talking about the kingdom of heaven. Matter of fact, in each one he says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like. Okay? And so he's doing more teaching, but this is more direct to his disciples, helping them to understand some things. So what is the theme we're looking at here? Yeah, give everything. So that first parable and the second parable, really, you give up whatever. You'll give everything. That's how important the kingdom of heaven is. But we don't have that in the parable of the dragnet. It's a little bit different there. They all have to do with the value of being in the kingdom. That's what they all have to do with. It is the value of being in the kingdom or a part of the kingdom. The dragnet is similar to the parable of the tares. Okay? And so what he does is he explains the parable of the tares. He tells these other 2 to show how important it is for you to be in the kingdom. And then he tells this other parable that he does not give an explanation for. He does give a little bit. If you notice in verse 49, so it will be at the end of the age, the angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. He is showing the value of you need to be in the kingdom. When the end comes, there is going to be a separation that happens. And you want to be in amongst those people who are part of the kingdom who will be kept. You don't want to be part of the ones who are being cast out. Okay, what is the result upon his disciples of him teaching these things? Look at verse 51. Have you understood these things? That's what Jesus says. Have you understood? How do they respond? Yes. Yes. Did he not teach them in parables? Yes. Why did they understand, but the multitudes would not understand? That goes back to the beginning of the chapter. Jesus beginning with this idea of these different levels of perception. There are going to be those who will receive it. There are going to be those who will not. Notice what it says in verse 52. Therefore, every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasures things new and old. They were learning new things. But all the things that they were learning were based upon what they've heard all their lives from the Old Testament, from the law, from the prophets, all the things they've been taught all those years. But Jesus is showing them new things from those. And that's the idea of the scribe. The scribe was the one, they would copy the law. They would copy the Old Testament, make copies of those things. And so those are the ones that would know the Old Testament. Okay? But we have new things that are brought out, and that's what Jesus is showing there. So, in terms of Matthew writing these things, Matthew is helping the reader to understand the old only brought them so far. You know, you can study that, but it's not going to get you all the way. And so now it is time for them to think differently. They needed to think differently about the Messiah. How did they need to think differently about the Messiah? How he would change things. And they knew that he was going to change things, but how did they believe that the Messiah was going to change things? He's going to establish an earthly kingdom. He's going to rule on his throne in Jerusalem, and everything's going to be great. He's going to conquer all the enemies and all of those things. Matthew is helping the reader understand he is not that kind of Messiah. And it is brought out in these parables and helping them to see those things. Again, verse 53, now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables that he departed from there. And so we'll pick up the rest of chapter 13 next week as we begin to studying the next section. Any thoughts? Yes, sir. All right, if the disciples couldn't understand the parables, why did he think the masses would understand? Were the disciples totally clueless? No. But not all of them. See, and that's kind of the point I think Matthew is trying to make here is, yes, even the disciples struggled a little bit with some of those, but they didn't struggle with all of them. They had an understanding, a spiritual mindset that they're applying to these parables, whereas the multitude did not. At least that multitude that he was speaking to then. Anything else? All right, thank you for your attention this morning.